My name is Kris Mauren. I'm the executive director of the Acton Institute. I have the privilege to be on a committee with Anita and others to help organize this event. So it's my pleasure to be here once again. And thank you, Anita, for giving me this 2 o'clock slot. I know it's a challenging slot, always a killer, which is why we chose our most scintillating topic for 2 p.m., financing cities. Okay, now, lest you think I'm being disingenuous, I'm actually quite serious. For as the old adage goes, all politics are local. And a focus on cities in a very real way helps us to get to where the action is. Now, you don't live in a city in America if you're not constantly bombarded by requests for millages. Usually for some service that you and I mistakenly thought was already part of the social contract. For example, in my home city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, in this past winter, the city let the roads disintegrate so badly that they could and did swallow whole cars. And then the city demanded a special 15-year millage to fix the potholes. Now, like in Grand Rapids, and I'm sure this is your experience, cities often rely on a little trickery to get these millages passed. They hide them in special elections when only their pro-tax constituencies can turn out. But even more devilish in our case, after the millage passed, of course it did, it was announced that the city needed to borrow tens of millions of dollars to fix the potholes through bond issuance. Why? Because the millage wouldn't start bringing money into the coffers for a year and a half. So now I probably don't need to insult your intelligence by stating how we got to where we are. Grand Rapids is not alone. Many localities, cities have precarious finances. Many are on the brink of bankruptcy, and as we'll learn in this panel, many are working their way through bankruptcy. But let me tell you the hopeful and truly exciting thing about the current mess in city financing. Like the alcoholic who has finally hit rock bottom, spendthrift cities must finally face up to their systemic problems and implement radical, fundamental changes. Or if I might paraphrase one of our panelists, Kevin, our next speaker's book for my optimism, he said, in regard to cities in general, along with the rest of the economy, the end is near and it's going to be awesome. How going broke will leave America richer, happier, and more secure. So, from my perspective, yes, we are entering into an era of interesting public policy competition at the city level. And we're going to see a lot of interesting things happen. Bad things, of course, but also many good things. And I'm fully confident that in the good things, we will see the power of good ideas, free markets, limited government, and entrepreneurship carry the day. And they will not only create prosperity for our local communities, but they will give us models and examples for our state and federal governments who surely need the same radical therapy. And therein lies my optimism and why I think this panel is exciting. So, we're going to start with our most radically exciting participant today, Kevin Williamson. He is National Review's roving correspondent and the author of several books. I just mentioned one. And when he's not sounding the alarm about financial Armageddon, he's also a theater critic for the New Criterion. He's a journalist by background, began his career and worked for 15 years in the newspaper business in Texas, Pennsylvania, Colorado. He served as the editor-in-chief of 3 newspapers and was the founding editor of Philadelphia's Bulletin. You'll see him on Fox News, CNBC, MSNBC, and NPR. You might not see him there. You might just hear him on NPR. With a lot of imagination, you can see him too. His work has appeared in dozens of publications. A native of the Republic of Texas, he now lives in New York City. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Williamson.
You know, in fact, it's because you can't see me on NPR that I suspect that's the one I'm most often invited to. You were mentioning millage, and I was a newspaper editor for a long time, and I would interview people for jobs just as long as they didn't have journalism degrees, because people with journalism degrees don't usually tend to make very good journalists. But so I tell them, I don't want to see your stupid college transcripts because I don't really believe that they're probably grading you according to any standards, and I just want you to define millage. And if they could define millage, they got past the first round. So yeah, we're dealing with some vastly complex, highly technical economic questions, which is, when you're doing that, everyone says, my God, is there a theater critic in the house? And so here I am to share my expertise. Because I'm precisely that kind of nerd, I'm a big fan of Chris Nolan's Dark Knight Batman movies. And there's a wonderful scene, the late Heath Ledger as the Joker, and he's explaining to Batman his plan for destroying Gotham, which is not to use a weapon of mass destruction or a bomb, but to turn people against each other and to reveal the average person as being as twisted and sick as he is. And the great line with which he closes is, I'm not a monster, I'm just ahead of the curve. And that's kind of how I feel about Detroit, which I've come here to talk about. It is, oddly enough, if you look at it in terms of its deep politics, its deep finances, it's not really that unusual a city. It's not very different from Cleveland or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. It's just that its problems started earlier than those cities did, and it's further along the path to chaos than some of those other places are. But I'm afraid, and I seriously believe, that Detroit is kind of what the future looks like for a lot of these cities, at least in purely financial terms. Some of you may remember a few years ago there was a movie came out called 8 Mile, starring the rapper Eminem. And 8 Mile paints this very bleak picture of underclass life in and around Detroit. When the movie came out, people were complaining, and there was this, the Chamber of Commerce put out a statement, or someone put out a statement that, makes Detroit look so bad, and, as someone from Detroit, you should have known better than to portray the city this way. But in fact, it's actually quite a bit worse, which begins with the fact that that movie never played in Detroit, because some years before that, Detroit's last movie theater had closed, its last first-run movie theater. It's the only city of its size, I think, in the country that doesn't have, or at least didn't have at that point, I'm not sure if one's open since then, although I can't imagine it would have, a first-run movie theater. If you look at the retail environment, the stuff that's just not there, normal stores you'll find other places, Home Depots, things like that. It's just bleak. 1 out of 5 residences is gone. They're burned down, fell down, abandoned, vandalized beyond habitation. They have 88,000 streetlights that don't work. That's most of the streetlights in the city. So people talk about, turn off the lights when you're done. Lights are sort of off there. But Detroit, weirdly enough, is kind of a strong brand in some ways. I don't know, there's a company called Shinola that makes kind of high-end watches. They're a Detroit-based company, and they advertise that fact, and they play up, we're made in Detroit, and like we're tough guy watches. It's not jewelry, it's a machine because it's from Detroit. There's a fashion designer by the name of John Varvatos, some of you may be familiar with. He's a Detroit native. And a couple of years ago, he did a special version of the Chrysler 300 automobile, where he designed the interior and was a special version of the car. And when they were rolling this car out, Chrysler unveiled what was then its new slogan, its new advertising slogan, which is imported from Detroit. And so, they like to play that up. John Varvatos doesn't operate in Detroit. He's from Detroit. He operates in New York City and Las Vegas and lots of other places. He announced actually a few days ago that after 15 years in the business, he's thinking about opening a place in Detroit. All right. The Chrysler 300 is made by Chrysler, which is not a company based in Detroit. It's an Italian company. Chrysler is owned by Fiat these days. And the 300 is built in Canada, in Ontario, I believe at the Brampton Works. So that's Detroit's big advertisement for itself. Here's an Italian company and a guy in New York selling you a Canadian car, but we're going to pretend like it's from Detroit because we all have this emotional connection to Detroit as the Motor City, as the home of the automotive industry. But the story of the automotive industry in Detroit is actually a little different from what most people think. 1895 to 1900 was kind of the birth of the automotive industry in the United States as a mass industry. In those 5 years, there were 69 new automobile companies started. Not one of them was in Detroit. They were mostly in New England and Ohio and a few other places. Detroit had a thriving economy long before the automobile and the industries associated with it wound up there. In fact, that's why cars ended up being made in Detroit, because Detroit already had all sorts of expertise from its other industries. Marine engines were built there, so people who knew how to design and engineer internal combustion engines were mostly based in and around Detroit. The carriage building industry was big in Detroit, so people who knew how to build frames and be wheelwrights and those sorts of things were there. So Detroit wasn't built by the automotive industry. The automotive industry was brought to Detroit by the fact that the city already had a thriving industrial, engineering-based economy long before those companies ever showed up. And what's happened with Detroit isn't really a result of the decline of the automobile industry. There are a couple of factors that have led Detroit to its current sorry state. One that some of the other guys here will talk about in some more detail than I will is just bad governance, especially profligate spending on pensions. And the pension thing, there's all sorts of technical stuff to talk about with pensions and discount rates and assumptions about this and that. But the main thing I think to appreciate about the pension problems is that the fundamental problem is cowardice. So you have these public sector unions, you have politicians that want to pay them more, but they don't want to put it on the budget. They don't want to tax people and take that money out and write these people checks every month or every 2 weeks for their salaries. So they promise them these great retirement benefits, and those, of course, you don't have to pay for. Well, eventually you have to pay for it, but you don't have to pay for them at the time of the promise. It doesn't show up on your budget every year. You have to go through this kind of kabuki thing of pretending like you're paying for them. And some states have been better and cities have been better and some have been worse. Oddly enough, New York, where I live, which is generally one of the worst governed places on earth, has done a reasonably good job of setting aside what it's supposed to for its pensions. I think they're technically at 88%, something like that. Illinois is like around 9%. And that's sort of optimistic. Well, because it's based on, we're going to make 6% for the next 30 years. Really? What are you invested in, buddy? The other problem that Detroit has, in a degree that's probably more severe than in a lot of other cities, is the problem of racial politics. And in Detroit, this goes back much further than it does in most places. You talk about Newark and Philadelphia and Los Angeles having race riots in the 1960s. Detroit was having them in the 1940s. Detroit is the only city in the United States to have been occupied by federal troops on 3 separate occasions. They almost all had to do with racial violence. And part of this goes to something that's not often talked about in American politics, which is the racial aspect of the New Deal and of progressivism in general. And part of it goes back to the fact that FDR was kind of not really good as an administrator. Most people don't really appreciate this about him because, he did win the war, so give him some credit. 1943 is kind of the episode in Detroit's history of racial problems. So you have a lot of black workers moving into Detroit. They're going to work in the war industries. Things are kind of cranking up. And this is not received with universal welcoming, the times being what they were. And the Roosevelt administration gets it into its head that they need to build some public housing for all the black workers who are coming into Detroit, which was probably not a bad idea because they couldn't get housing through normal channels. There weren't really places for them to live. And so they announced this big housing project, and they name it after Sojourner Truth, symbolic. And then they changed their mind. There was a local representative in Detroit, Catholic Democrat by the name of Tnerowitz. And because the Sojourner Truth projects were going up in what had been a Polish neighborhood, there are just, there are protests, there are cross burnings, there are all these sorts of things. And so the Roosevelt administration, even though people have already started moving in, put down deposits, things like that, flips and decides this is going to be an all-white housing project instead of an African-American housing project. There was a civil rights leader at the time named Charles Hill, the Reverend Charles Hill, who very wryly observed, apparently Mr. Roosevelt thinks that Sojourner Truth was a Polish lady. But violence breaks out and it gets pretty nasty. At the same time, Packard decides to hire 3 African-American workers on one of its assembly lines. In response to the hiring of these 3 African-American workers, 25,000 unionized auto workers walk off the job. Violence breaks out left and right. We have to send 6,000 troops in to quell the violence in Detroit. Detroit at the time had a Republican mayor, a guy named Jeffries, who was actually pretty solid on some of the civil rights stuff. He was the one who had pressed for the project to be built there in the first place. But because he was a Republican, FDR didn't really respond very quickly when the violence started. In fact, it wasn't until the Germans started using clips in their propaganda videos during the war that the US government actually got up and reacted. So, white people writ large, I think, and conservatives especially, often have a hard time understanding the sort of racial solidarity politics that organizes a city like Detroit. But look at it from the black point of view. All politics has been racialized for African Americans and had been for hundreds of years. And those habits of thought are not going to go away quickly. Unfortunately, though, ethnic solidarity politics tends to enable some of the worst forms of government. It's not just in African American run cities. You see the same thing in old ethnic Catholic democratic machines in places like Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, or Delaware County, those kinds of places. This sort of clan-oriented politics, everything from reason to principle to the idea of the rule of law and everything else gets subordinated to that. Now in Detroit, this led to some really spectacularly bad outcomes, one of which was called Kwame Kilpatrick, some of you may remember, who was the mayor of Detroit for a long time, currently a resident of Oklahoma, where he is known as federal prisoner number 44678-039. And, just looted the city for God knows how much money. I don't think they ever really got a real accounting of it. When Coleman Young was the mayor of New York, and he was a very sort of racially polarizing guy, kind of flamboyant, black power sort of guy, one time explained Detroit's problems as the money left the city in the back pockets of the white people. His police chief and his deputy police chief, which is to say his number 1 and his number 2 law enforcement officers, between them stole almost $3 million from the city. And Coleman Young stayed as mayor for 20 years, something like that. The idea of accountability just disappears when everything becomes about this one polarizing us and them sort of issue. And you see the same thing in places like Philadelphia. Some years ago, Democrat turned nominal Republican, and in New York we don't know anything about those, by the name of Sam Katz was running for mayor, and Sam Katz, as you might guess from his name, is Jewish, and was running against an African-American candidate. And the level of just anti-Semitism and racism and such that was poured his way for having the temerity to seek to be mayor of the city in which he lived was just shocking. I saw things there on the ground covering that I just never expected to. But in Detroit, of course, you have a much more complicated situation because the city went from being an almost entirely white city to an almost entirely black city in a very, very short period of time. Trying to remember the numbers here exactly. So from 1960 to 1970, Detroit lost 158,000 residents. In 1 year, it lost something like 22,000. People were just up and moving. But the really shocking thing is, even though it only lost on net 158,662 residents, during those same years, it lost 344,000 white residents. the white population of Detroit just basically packed up and left in the course of a very short period of time. In 1950, there were 1.5 million white people living in Detroit. Today, there are 75,000. This sort of polarization has aspects that aren't always obvious to people. So when you're looking at who's moving in, who's moving out, it's not just a racial thing, obviously. If you look at the median household income for African-American households in Detroit from 1965 to 1980, it goes sort of like that, about a 50-degree angle down. And that's not because these households were suddenly becoming poor. It's because after the white middle class moved out, the black middle class, really over the course of about 12 years, just as one got up and moved, left to the suburbs. If you look at the population of the overall Detroit metro area, it hasn't really changed all that radically. And some of the counties around Detroit, in fact, have gained population in the last years. But Detroit, which was once, I guess, at its biggest, maybe it was the 7th largest U.S. city, 6th. Was it the 4th? Wow. It's today smaller than Fort Worth. It has just over 700,000 residents, something like that. So 1950, no one was talking about, big cities like Fort Worth, still known as Cowtown. So that sort of thing produces really bad political outcomes. And when you have this sort of us and them mentality, the idea that you're going to go in and have a state government where you have a white governor and you have a city like Detroit where you've got these unionized public sector workers who are almost unanimously African American, or just overwhelmingly so, there's no way to sort out a bankruptcy in a place like Detroit without making it a cultural issue. And it becomes a very, very dicey thing. And which is one of the reasons why Detroit's bankruptcy process has been such a joke. The current retirees who have, I don't know, it's $18 billion that they need to fund their pensions they don't have agreed to take a cut on net of 4.5%. And plus some, cost of living stuff down the road. The police and firemen are taking no cut, except in their eventual cost of living adjustments, which will go down from 2.5% to 1% or something like that. So my guess is Detroit ends up back in bankruptcy court in 5 or 10 years at the most. It's been a very politicized process. Creditors who should have been paid were strong-armed. People who should have been taking a bigger haircut because they had political clout were able to keep that from being done. If you're a real big believer in the rule of law, it's the sort of thing that is going to depress you. But there's no way to really put this just in economic terms. Detroit has an illegitimacy rate right now of 85%. It has high schools in which the graduation rates average around 25%. But there are also economic consequences of that. Insurance in Detroit costs about 300% of what it does across the city line in the suburban surrounding counties. So it becomes a very, very difficult place to live unless you have so much money that it doesn't matter, or unless you have so little money that it doesn't matter. And that's not really an outcome you want. We missed a huge opportunity. We had this big post-war boom, and that's what we all think of as normal in the United States, these years from 1950 to about the middle 1970s when we were a manufacturing powerhouse. You could get out of high school, go get a job at a factory and buy a house. All this, it's largely mythological, but there was something to it. The part of that we always ignore is that the rest of the world was a smoking ruin because there had just been this enormous war, and most of the world's surviving manufacturing capacity was still here in the United States. In 1950, the U.S. Was responsible for 60% of the planet's manufacturing output. We had 61% of the total economic output of the OECD at the time. These were highly unusual times, but all of our assumptions about how we're going to handle pensions, about how we organize our cities, about what our economy can look like, are based on this highly unusual period of time. We're talking about, PJ was talking about the baby boomers. That was the world they grew up in, but that's not the real world. In the long term, the real per capita growth in GDP in the United States over the course of our history averages around 2%. And anything that is based on more optimistic expectations than that is probably not going to come to pass. Now, Detroit, being in the situation it's in, is maybe a little less difficult to swallow because it has become a relatively small city. That's my minute-and-a-half warning. And some of the other guys will get into this a little bit more, but you know, you've got a city of 700,000 people. It is the largest city to have gone bankrupt, the largest municipality in the United States to go bankrupt, but it's still not that big. When it's Los Angeles, or when it's the whole state of Illinois, or when it's the whole state of New Jersey, you're going to be in for a whole different set of problems. And unwinding these trillions of dollars we have in obligations is a project that there's no historical precedent for. No one knows how it's going to turn out. You've seen debt crises and financial crises in other countries, but not really for one that's 23% of the world's GDP. There's no one who can come in and bail out the United States. It just doesn't work that way. It's like, you know, trying to bail out a whale. It's just not going to happen. So yeah, Detroit, I think, is a warning about where things are going, but it's going to be much, much worse when it's a big city. When you try to figure out how to rationalize the finances of a place as big as Los Angeles, which is probably insolvent. Los Angeles isn't in bankruptcy, and it's not showing any signs of going in there right now, but it probably should. It is way upside down on its obligations. Sorting that out is not something that anybody has ever done before, and there's no way of knowing how it's going to turn out. So the thing that economists worry about often is uncertainty. These are indeed very uncertain times. Thank you.
Kevin, your job was supposed to make us hopeful.
Surely you didn't bring me here for that.
So we're going to leave that to Wayne.
I'm going to fail in that as well.
Okay. Wayne Winegarden has 20 years of experience in business economics and politics and a PhD from George Mason University. His policy research examines the impact from fiscal and regulatory policies on economic growth. His columns have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, Investor's Business Daily, and Forbes. He's testified in front of Congress. He's worked around the world, including Hong Kong and New York, and as a policy analyst in Washington, D.C. He's currently a partner with Capital Economic Advisors and a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute. He is going to join us and give us a case study of 3 cities in Chicago who are hopefully working their way through bankruptcy. Thank you very much. Wayne.
One correction, I'm good, actually California, not Chicago, but you did, but that's okay. I wish I had an optimistic message, I really do. Picking up where Kevin left off, Los Angeles, that actually is a great connection between Detroit and these 3 California cities, Vallejo, I apologize for my pronunciation there, Vallejo, San Bernardino, and Stockton. There's a pattern. You know, Mark Twain said that history it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now, you see this rhyme between the cities. Detroit has had a very similar pattern in some ways that Vallejo has had, and it's gone through bankruptcy and is back out. San Bernardino has gone through the same pattern. So it's Stockton. Well, Los Angeles really, it is on the exact same train track. It's just a few years behind. And what I wanted to do with you today is go through some of the numbers. I'm an economist, I apologize, so I'm going to bore you with some numbers. But I wanted to walk through what is that pattern? What should we be looking for when we're looking at these municipalities? Because it is a crisis. I wish I could be optimistic, but there is a crisis. And for these cities, it's worse because not only is there a municipal crisis, but there's a state crisis. You may have heard that California doesn't implement the best state policies that are out there. In fact, Prop 30, I don't know, is anyone here familiar with what Prop 30 has brought? Basically, Prop 30 decided, they call it the millionaire's tax. But if you live in California, after you pay all your federal income taxes, and with the AMT, you probably need to pay your full state taxes as well, you have to pay another 13.3% to the state government, which is pretty outrageous. Actually, Phil Mickelson, he had the gall to say that was excessive, and quickly apologized, because how dare he say that, but it actually cost him $1.8 million. It seems a bit excessive to me. Tiger Woods, right, before he went pro, you guys know where he lived? California. Where did he move to? Florida. Why? No income tax. If you look what Prop 30 would have done, he saved in 2012 alone Tiger Woods saved $12.5 million. $12.5 million because he lived in Florida, not in California. So, well, what this relates to for the cities is two things. One, these cities have a problem in and of themselves because they've got a terrible state, and they've got to wear that pall around their neck, and that's difficult to deal with. But the other issue is what is one of the ultimate arbiters of where, of how good an economy is. Right? Detroit had the same thing. Do people want to live there? Right? People want to live in places that they say, oh, okay, this is a good place, good, strong quality of life, good public services, and I can keep a large portion of my money so I can decide where I want to spend it, how I want to allocate it. Well, California, 13.3% at state taxes alone, you really don't have that option. So for those of you who aren't familiar with California geography, it's not quite up yet. There it is. This is where the cities are. So Stockton and Vallejo are really on the outer banks of San Francisco area, whereas Stockton's down by LA. One of the things they have in common is they're not central cities, right? They're kind of a far distance away from kind of the main area of either San Francisco or LA. Now, there's a certain pattern or a certain kind of similarity that those cities have, and then the same similarities with Detroit. And it's the same thing we think about Los Angeles, going down that same path. And the very first thing is, if you are fiscally insolvent, and this goes whether it's a personal bankruptcy, whether it's a corporate bankruptcy, or whether it's a municipal bankruptcy, right? If you personally go bankrupt, but you leave off the very expensive sports car and the payment you have on that sports car, you're not going to be financially sustainable. Well, the same thing goes with the cities. Up until now, and it's beginning to change, we'll get in that in a few moments, pensions have been considered special, right? They are an obligation, probably, I would argue an obligation no different than any type of bond contract you went into. But up until now, by law, they have been different. And Vallejo's biggest mistake, and Detroit's biggest mistake, has been that they have not fully dealt with their unfunded pension problem. And these municipalities will never become fiscally sustainable in the long term without dealing with pension. It kind of goes back to PTA work and the baby boomers, right? This is all intermingled. But our municipalities will not be stable until that pension issue is dealt with. It's one and the same issue. The other big lesson is that the economy matters. Right? We can see when we go through Vallejo, both before they declared bankruptcy as well as after, their economy continued to underperform. You will never be able to restore your fiscal solvency if you don't have a vibrant economy or have a growing economy. So, for instance, San Bernardino, it's Stockton, when they, part of their plan, they're raising sales taxes. Well, just at a time when your reputational effect is being impacted and people are leaving the city, raising taxes and the last few people working is probably not the best strategy for revitalizing the economy. So taking care of your economy matters as well. And the other fact, which I think should be obvious, but for some reason isn't, is the idea that Chapter 9 is not a solution. Right? People say, oh, okay, well, we declared Chapter 9, so we'll be okay. No, Chapter 9 is the beginning of a process. Right? And there's a few key issues that I wanted to share with you in Chapter 9. I think some of you may be familiar, but just to make sure we're all on the same page with this. We talk about, well, why declare Chapter 9? What's the point? The only benefit that a municipality gets from declaring Chapter 9 bankruptcy is they get time, breathing room, and a judicial structure. Right? That, in effect, forces all of your creditors to sit down in an organized way. You're not bleeding money. Everyone can be calm, and you can then figure out, okay, who gets what haircut? And that's really what you're talking about, right? You can't get blood from a stone. We don't have enough money to pay everyone back, right? Now, part of course, then this is where the pension issue comes in. If you take all of your pension obligations off the table, if you're a bondholder, then the haircut you need to take is just going to be increased dollar for dollar for every pension dollar you bring off, right? So, but that's all you get from declaring Chapter 9, is that judicial process to kind of deal with your debts. And there's a tremendous amount of costs. Right? The first one, which probably makes a lot of sense, is that if you declare bankruptcy, we're going to call you a higher credit risk. Right? I mean, I wouldn't go out and lend money to Vallejo, California right now. So the credit risk should go down, the interest cost goes up. That's a very large cost that all municipalities have to pay. The other issue, of course, is then the damage to the image. We make fun of Detroit now. We make fun of Orange County, of Vallejo, of Stockton. So your image suffers, and that image suffering can lead to a vicious circle. The vicious circle, of course, being residents leave. That resident leaving reduces your tax base. With the lower tax base, tax revenues start to go down. All of this starts to circle. And so what you haven't seen in any of these cities, which is very important, difficult to do in California, but a key lesson is, okay, what do we do to attract people back to our city? We know we've declared bankruptcy, right? San Bernardino is one of the most beautiful places in the country, right? There's a lot of natural factors that should be encouraging people to live to San Bernardino. How do we leverage that to get people, activity, jobs back to the city? And without that consideration, right, again, your municipal bankruptcy is not going to be successful. So with that as a kind of a, I'm sorry, one thing I also wanted to mention, which is a unique factor of Chapter 9 compared to bankruptcy for corporations, for individuals, and that is the idea that you can't force, when you're in Chapter 9 bankruptcy, you can't be forced to liquidate any assets. You can't be forced to, in a corporate bankruptcy, for instance, right, you can shut the corporate company down. Right? You can't do that in municipality. Municipalities are, as long as someone's living there, there are services that need to be provided. If those services need to be provided, they have to have the revenues and the ability to do that. Also, additionally, the policy decisions are not supposed to be made by the court. I know that might sound a bit ridiculous, but in theory, that's what the case is supposed to be. So again, you can't force policy on the municipality through the bankruptcy proceedings. So that makes Chapter 9 a bit different than other bankruptcies, and more importantly for the municipalities, it gives them better negotiating leverage. So when you see this inability for the municipalities to get rid of the pensions, well, they're in a much better negotiating position. They should be able to kind of affect that change. And hopefully we'll see in a couple of rulings with Detroit, and there was a ruling with respect to Stockton that might hopefully give us some hope in that area. So if we look at Vallejo, Vallejo is a perfect case study of public choice economics. Right? I studied economics at George Mason, and we like public choice. We think it's a very good way of viewing the world. And in Vallejo, you had a very, very powerful public unions. And I think that's a commonality across most municipalities. And in this case, what you had, firefighters were paying $230 a month in union dues. You had police officers, they paid $254 a month. When you build that over time, again and again, what you end up with is a very powerful public employee union. And so what they negotiated were, and I kind of put some of those numbers in bold for you, I think are some pretty outrageous salaries. There was a police captain who made over $300,000 a year. Now, I know you're in the outer areas of San Francisco, but I still think that's a bit excessive. You know, your average firefighter was making north of $170,000 a year. They also had the gold-plated pensions, which you qualify for within 5 years. And you also had this wonderful little payout option where if you didn't use your vacation days when you retired, you got to cash out the value of that. And so, again, people with their incentives, they figure these things out. You end up gaming the system. You're talking about, in some cases, and these are the extremes, but you know, $370,000 in payouts. Okay? So what you had, in effect, is a public employee union that, in effect, took over the system. They were demanding excessive salaries. They were demanding excessive benefits. And through a compliant city council, they were able to get it. And I love the Mayor Davis's quote, and I have it up there. I can't quite see it. He goes, if you have a can that's leaking 2 ounces a minute, and you put an ounce a minute in it, it's going to get empty, right? And that's exactly what happened. And you can see economically going into when they declared bankruptcy. They declared bankruptcy in 2008. They had a slight decline in population every year. That's that small little black line that every year 0.03%, you know, 3 basis points, a slight decline, but in fact a stagnant population, right? And on top of that, you had the economy was growing much slower than the U.S. average. In this case, we're talking about 1.6% slower. So you had a slow growing economy and a declining population. People are not choosing to live in Vallejo. And that shows up in their budget. So here what you have is you have the expenditures of the city of Vallejo in the black line, and in the blue dotted line, we have what their revenues are. And you can see that from 2004 to 2008, when their forced to declare bankruptcy, their revenues are going down. Their declining economy is not allowing them to have any type of growth in their tax base. Now, they didn't align their expenditures with it, and that was combined with the housing bust, right, kind of a shock. And that's kind of one of the patterns you see. There's an economic shock that pushes the municipality over. In this case, we had the Great Recession. It pushed over Vallejo. It could no longer play games, switch things around, move money from one bucket to another. So they were out of options and had to declare bankruptcy. But going into that, you had that fundamental problem of excessive costs, right, as well as kind of a declining tax revenue base. Now, you can't say that Vallejo didn't try or didn't cut spending. And that's the really interesting thing about the case study. When you look at what they did, they cut services dramatically. My favorite quote, and I kind of have it up there in bold, where they asked residents, and this is in an area that's got higher crime than average, right? So you have a high crime city, and they asked the residents to use the 911 system judiciously. So I don't know what judiciously using the 911 system is, but I guess if you can drive yourself to the hospital when you're having a heart attack, that's what they would recommend. They cut the number of police officers almost by 40%. They cut all sorts of services. They cut the youth groups. They cut service centers. They stopped doing any type of infrastructure development. So you're talking about really cutting into the bone. They're reducing the quality of life kind of services that would make somebody want to live in Vallejo, right? So you can't say that they did not do cuts or they didn't cut spending. They did. And you can actually see that when you look at their expenditures. Right? Ever since they went bankrupt, their expenditures plummeted. Right? The problem is they didn't touch the pensions, and that's kind of our recurring theme here. They didn't cut the pensions, and so the problem wasn't solved. So a few things are happening now. One is that population exodus has accelerated. So as before, we had a slight decline in population. Now it's becoming more than just a trickle. So people are choosing not to live in Vallejo. Now, of course, you have the broader California kind of trends pushing them out as well, but there's certainly the impact from the municipal bankruptcy is there too. And you have an extreme, this is again relative, so when the Great Recession is here, but it's relative to the rest of the country, an extreme economic underperformance. So the city economically is doing worse, which is what you would predict, right? When they went into bankruptcy, they didn't do anything to kind of encourage greater growth. And the result is a severe decline in growth, people choosing to leave, falling services, falling revenues, and most importantly, their budget's still not stable. This is from I apologize for blocking part of it. This is from the Vallejo City's budget, and this is their projections. This is what they expect. This is probably, you can almost imagine a best case scenario over the next 10 years, okay, through 2020, actually the next 6 years. Right? And they're imagining that their revenues are going to be very small. They're not going to get much growth in revenues, which is probably correct. They're trying to tamp down on their expenditures, but the big thing that kind of jumps off from that chart is the huge, over 8% increase in pension costs. So that their pensions, which are currently about 13% of their general fund expenditures, are going to grow to 21% of the budget. And that's probably their best case scenario. Okay, which basically means that the city is still financially insolvent. Right? They went through and endured all the costs associated with declaring Chapter 9 bankruptcy. They went through all the things. Bondholders got a haircut by 50%. Police officers got pink slips. Services were not performed, and yet they're going to end up right back in bankruptcy, just like Detroit. We'll be back in the same situation because they didn't address the underlying causes. Okay. Now, for Stockton, California, and San Bernardino, and I'm not going to bore you going through the same process over and over again, but if you look at kind of what's happened, it's the same thing. There was the economic shock. All of them suffered from the Great Recession, but that shock was just what pushed them over. The problem was they were fiscally unsound, and they're fiscally unsound because of the pension problem, and therefore, when they were in a position where they could no longer manage those that difference anymore, they went into bankruptcy. So the lesson, I'm going to skip ahead to that because we are running out of time a little bit. You can just see these charts kind of, again, it's the same patterns over and over again, is that you have to understand and watch for those kind of weakening economic fundamentals. We talked about Los Angeles. Los Angeles is in on that same path. If you look at their pension problem, it's tremendous. It actually makes Vallejo's pension problem look small in comparison, right? It's in the news today about their budget deficit. They can't get that under control, right? When the next economic shock hits, right? Not if, but when that next economic shock hits, like hurricanes in Florida, you know they're going to come. Los Angeles really needs to be on the kind of the watch list because they're in bad enough shape that they may not be able to withstand that storm, right? The lesson is, well, what you need to do is you need to, one, what Vallejo did, you need to address your expenditure problems, you need to bring salaries in line, you need to address those problems, but what you also need to do is you need to get the pensions under control. Now, that's very easy for an academic to say, and we were actually having this conversation before the presentation today. Getting the pensions under control, right now, most states offer what they call defined benefits programs. And is everyone familiar with that? Basically, they say, we'll pay you $5,000 a month for the rest of your life once you retire. In a lot of these places, you can retire at 55, 60, some very young age. Those are unaffordable. Those are not going to be able to, those promises are not going to be able to be fulfilled. The problem is, what they should move to is the defined contribution plan. Defined contribution says, we'll give you $2,000, you can save it, do whatever you want with it, and take care of your own retirement. That's in the private sector, that's what most people have, defined contribution. Here's the kicker, and here's the problem. If you switch all of the public employees over from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan, you take out all the young workers, right? That's the base of our Ponzi scheme, right? If you have a Ponzi scheme, you need new money to come in order to pay the people at the top. So if we all of a sudden just say, okay, let's get everyone into a defined benefit plan, what you've just done is you just told the municipality they need to spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, in order to kind of pay off the promises that they've already made. And so that's kind of the track. Like I said, it's not, I wish I could be optimistic, but I guess I'm an economist, so I'm supposed to be pessimistic, right? So it's not a pretty situation. The first step, though, has to be freezing the current system. So, you know, if you're in a hole, the first step is to stop digging, right? And so that's really, you know, practically, what's the first thing to do? You've got to freeze the pension systems, and you've got to take an assessment of kind of how large the problem is, and, you know, there's different creative solutions out there that we need to work toward in order to move that current unfunded liability into something that is affordable and that's fair to both the taxpayers as well as the pensioners. And I have 7 seconds left, so I guess I'll will that back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. We've piled it all upon the shoulders of our next panelist, Rick Baker, but I'm actually confident that he will give us some reason for optimism, because Rick has done it. He has done it. In 2001, Rick Baker was elected mayor of St. Petersburg, which is Florida's 4th largest city. Under Mayor Baker's leadership, St. Petersburg experienced a renaissance as its downtown became one of the most vibrant in the Southeast. He's received numerous awards for his leadership in St. Petersburg, including being named America's Mayor of the Year by Governing Magazine. He has an MBA and a law degree with honors from Florida State University and studied comparative law at Oxford, and also served as a legal intern on Florida's Supreme Court. He's an adjunct fellow of the Manhattan Institute and the author of this book, The Seamless City, a book about city leadership and urban revitalization. Mayor Baker now serves as the president of Edwards Group, a St. Petersburg-based group of companies involved in development, hotels, real estate, entertainment, and hospitality. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kris. I'm depressed. I was going to give a great talk, but I'm really depressed now. No, thank you, Wayne, and thank you, Kevin. I'm very happy to be here for a couple of reasons. You know, I enjoyed all the talks today. I should disclose something. While I was mayor a few years ago, I went down with ESPN to Fort Lauderdale to try to get a college bowl game to come to St. Petersburg. That's what mayors do. They try to bring stuff to the city for economic development and other reasons, and we succeeded. We got a bowl game to come to St. Pete, and it's been there for a number of years, and I just found out recently there was an announcement that the bowl game received a new sponsor and a new name for the bowl game. So this December, our college bowl game in St. Petersburg is going to be called the Bitcoin Bowl. So that is a true story, and I'm now trying to figure out, was it some Japanese guy we don't know that's doing it or what? I don't know. But yesterday I had the opportunity to meet with BitPay folks who were trying to work in our shopping center. That's a whole other topic, BitPay, related to Bitcoin. And so in the process, I signed up for Bitcoin, and I got my first $20 wallet Bitcoin. And after this morning's talk, I'm wondering, am I going to have an IRS problem now? Do I have to do a report for? I think that's what they said this morning. So I may have to get rid of that Bitcoin. It is honor to be here with these great panelists. It's an honor to be at Hillsdale College. I am kind of an endangered species. You know, I'm a social and fiscal conservative that was mayor of a large city. And there aren't too many of those in the country. And I can tell you that when you are in that position, to have groups like Hillsdale College that put ideas on the table. You know, Jeb Bush was a great governor in Florida, was a good friend of mine, and he talks about the power of great ideas. And that's what Hillsdale is doing, gathering folks together, discussing, debating, and I'm very, very appreciative. I can't tell you how much how helpful it is to have Hillsdale, and thank you for having me here. You know, you just heard the talks, and I kind of personalize it because I've sat in the seat for 9 years, and imagine that you are the mayor of a city, and you've got your group of advisors around you, your outside auditors, your financial folks, your accountants, your political advisors, everybody around the table, and you've been going over the books of the city. And all of a sudden, you come to the conclusion that you've got to declare bankruptcy for your city. That's a hard day. That is a very, very tough moment to go through. And you wonder, how does a city get to that? And we've heard a little bit about it, but how does a city get to the point where a city's got to declare bankruptcy? By the way, we're the good story. St. Pete's doing great. I should start out by saying that so people aren't thinking, oh, here's the third ballot. But how does a city get to that point? Well, I think it can be external. You know, might have an auto industry that's pulling back, and you might lose jobs in that city, and that's going to hurt things. You got, like in Philadelphia, you might have a shipyard that closes down, and you're trying to figure out how to backfill that, and those are issues. But I think a lot of the issues, as you've heard, are self-inflicted. You have poor leadership. I think almost, you talk about any business, any organization of any kind, any city, if you have poor leadership, it's not going to advance very far. So if you have a leader come in, and they say, okay, I'm going to bring all my political friends with me to give them six-figure jobs because they've never had that before, and we're going to put them into these administrative positions in the city, which happens. We know that happens. And then are they going to be effective? Are they going to provide the services that the city needs at the quality that the city needs? No, not going to happen. At the same time, you do. The unions are very involved in the political process at the mayor's level, but also at the city council level. And the unions, I think, have even more influence on the city council level because not that many folks get involved in city council elections. So you can have a disproportionate influence on it. So they do. And then afterwards, of course, their job is to advocate for pay and benefits and conditions for their people that are in their unions. So in order to keep getting reelected, you pay more and you give more benefits, and sometimes you give pension benefits because, again, you might not even have to pay for that till down the road. And so the costs start to climb, and the costs go up and up and up. So you have services going down and costs going up. And then the costs go up, so the simplistic solution to that, if you're on the liberal side, raise tax rates, because you got to be able to get those costs in, so you raise tax rates. So you raise tax rates, and actually, when you have a boom like we just had, it exacerbates it, because you have more revenues coming in than is natural. because your ad valorem revenues are going up, because your property values are higher, your sales tax are going up, because you have this big boom going on. And so because you have all these revenues going in, if you don't have discipline, then you start finding ways to spend it. So you add employees to the city, you give more benefits, and you give more costs. And it's, so at some point, you hit a wall. You have, as Wayne said, you hit a great recession. And two things happen in a recession. One is your revenues go down, right? Sales tax revenues, property tax. So you've increased all these expenses to match these increasing revenues. And all of a sudden your revenues drop. Guess what? Your expenses don't drop. So that happens. And then your pension accounts get devalued because the market crashes. So you've got your pension, a lot of pensions down 30%, 35%, 25%. So when that happens, you have to increase your actuarial payments to the pension account. So you have a spike in expenses beyond the high expenses you already have. And it gets to be a downward spiral, because when taxes go up and services go down, people leave. And as that continues to spiral down, it's very, very hard to pull out of that. When I was, before I ran for mayor in 2001, I had written a book on the history of Florida and St. Petersburg. And I really studied, at that time, the periods of the boom and the crash in the 20s and 30s in Florida, because that was a very significant part of our state's history. So what happened was, in the 20s, you had the lot boom in Florida. And the lot boom was, you had developers, we had a lot of tourists coming in, you had developers come in, and they subdivided these orange groves into residential single-family home lots, okay? And they sold these lots, but they weren't selling them for people moving. They were selling them as investments. They were selling to people coming in and saying, you know, these lots have been going up every year in value, and if you buy them now, you can sell them next year, you can pay for both vacations, and it doesn't cost, so the lot value started going up and up and up and up. Well, in order to pay for the infrastructure for those lots, the city of St. Pete issued bonds, and the bonds went to pay for brick roads and water and sewer to cover all of these subdivided lots in the city, bridges to go to some of our barrier island residential areas. So to the point where St. Pete, before the crash, had the second highest bond per capita of debt in the country, behind Atlantic City back at the time. So then these lots kept going up and up and up and up and up and up in value, until, as one developer back then said, we ran out of suckers. So it crashed. The whole thing in 1925, 4 years before the stock market crash, the real estate industry in Florida crashed. It was so bad that there were attorney generals in northern states that were freezing accounts so that their residents of their states could not send money down to Florida to buy lots. That's how bad it was. So in 25, we had a real estate depression, and then in 29, we had the Great Depression, stock market crash. I like to say St. Pete boomed like nobody else boomed during the 20s, and it crashed like nobody else crashed in the Great Depression. Every bank in the city went out of business. Of course, like everywhere else in the country, widespread unemployment. Couldn't pay our bonds. So we kind of bled our way through the 30s until we had a refinancing plan, and it was a very detailed 1937 refinancing plan, which, because I'm a fun guy, I read and studied, and it talked about how the city eventually pulled its way out. Now, why do I talk about that? Because I came to the conclusion, before I ran for, as I was running for office, and from my experience in the city, that the issue in advancing a city and the finances of a city are twofold. First is, when you have a boom, and if you know the history of Florida, you know there are going to be booms and busts, so you got to plan for the bust. And when you have a boom, that's when you plan for the bust. That's important. People didn't do that, but that's when you do it. And the second thing you need to understand is that, yes, there are individual aspects. The pension is a critical one. The whole discussion of defined benefit versus defined contribution, I get, I understand, I agree with. It's a tough issue, and it's a big issue in the financial aspects of things. But there are other issues. And what a city, if you have a city like Detroit, which lost, I think from 1950 to today, something like 1 million people, or a city like St. Louis, that same period of time, lost 500,000 people, Philadelphia, Baltimore. What do you do with all those empty houses? What do you do with those empty neighborhoods? I mean, you could fix the pension plans in Detroit tomorrow, which would be a good thing. You're still going to have a lot of problems. you're going to still have economic problems, you're going to have crime problems, you're going to have a lot of problems. So the way we approach governance in St. Pete, and it's really what my book, Seamless City, is about. It's how do you develop a strategic plan for running a business? You know, Wayne and I were talking earlier. In business, you start talking about strategic planning, and people just say, well, of course you do that. But not so much in government, but they should. So we developed a strategic plan for running our city. And it started with a mission statement. We set a goal of building the best city in America by working every day to make the quality of life for the people living there great. Now, people will always tell me, well, yeah, that's easy to say. Best city in America. You can't measure that. You can't. And my response is, you know, if I set a goal of becoming the 4th best city in Florida, who's going to follow me, right? But people follow quests for excellence. Resources come to quest for excellence. People want to be part. If you're working to become the best at something, people want to become it. So then we identified 5 strategic areas within that mission statement that we were going after. Public safety, economic development, schools, neighborhoods, and government services and finances, okay? So, public safety, #1 job of any mayor in any city in the country. If the public safety is not going well, if your crime rates are not going up, if kids are afraid to come out of their house, you're not going to move that city anywhere. You're never going to get people moving in or businesses. Your economics are never going to take off. You have to do that. You have to focus on that. #1 job. And it's, by the way, the police officers is the toughest job in the city. You know, we talk a lot about pensions and issues like that, and I get that, and I understand it. Police officer is the toughest job in the city. The second issue, schools. We put in place a very expansive program to support our public schools in St. Pete because, you know, I ran for mayor, I said, I'm going to advocate for the schools and work for the schools. And people said, why are you doing that? Because that's not under the city. In most cities, the schools aren't under the city. And my response was, if the schools aren't good, people aren't going to move into your community. And the businesses aren't going to come to your community. And you're never going to advance the city economically, and you're never going to get your finances in control if your schools are not good. So in Florida, you may know Governor Bush did the A+ program where we grade our schools, every school, A, B, C, D, F, based on the student achievement scores of the students in the schools. I think that's how you should do it, by the way. I think you should determine if a school's doing well based on the achievement scores of the kids. Other people have other criteria. I think they're crazy. This one, I think, is the work. So what we did is we patterned after that, and we put programs in place to support our public schools. And I could talk at length about them, but I won't. But suffice it to say that at the end of the day, our elementary schools went from having 0 A out of 27 elementary schools to 16 A elementary schools out of 27. The number of A and B schools went up by 260%. You have to advance your schools. It's a critical part of advancing the overall city. You cannot turn a city around without turning around the schools in the city. Our neighborhoods. We did a lot in neighborhood. We have 110 formed neighborhood associations in the city of St. Pete. We advanced the neighborhoods, and we put programs in place. I know it's a finance talk, but the quality of life is key. If you don't have good quality of life, people won't live there. Businesses won't come there. I've been able to get businesses to come to St. Petersburg, big businesses, solely on the basis of quality of life. Other cities and other states were giving them more economic development money. We sold quality of life, and we won. And that's how you keep your city vibrant moving forward. So we did things like bike paths. We built the largest bike path system in the southeast United States. We made a commitment to build a playground within a half-mile walk of every child in the city. We did parks. We became a designated green city. We did skateboard parks. We did dog parks. Dog parks. I love dog parks. We did it. We had in 2 days. One day we broke ground on a $2 million library. About a dozen people came. The next day we cut the ribbon on a $9,000 dog park. Fence, bench, fire hydrant. It's cute. 200 people showed up for that ribbon cutting for that dog park. They wore out the grass. The neighbors started saying, get these people out of our neighborhood. They're wearing out of grass. And I'm thinking, okay, they're cheap. Everybody loves them. I would like to get reelected. We're going to build a lot of dog parks. And we got dog parks all over the city. So you work on things to improve the neighborhoods. That, believe it or not, is tied to the finances because you can't separate this stuff. You got to do it all. And economic development, as Kris said, we have, I will say it to anybody from Florida, we have the most vibrant nighttime weekend downtown in the state of Florida today. It is a very exciting place to be. You ought to all come down, visit us. It's St. Petersburg has become cool with the nightlife and the sidewalk cafes and the art. Number one art city in America for cities under 500,000, and that's 99.5% of the cities in the country. So lots going on in the economic development downtown. I could talk a long time ago about that. I won't. Government services and taxes. So during the boom, we tried to do things that would prepare us for the bust. And so we had to increase the number of police officers and pay to police officers because the other jurisdictions around us paid much more and were stealing our police officers on a regular basis, and we could not get to full strength. We ended in full strength. But that was the main expenditure we made. But we also reduced positions in the city in order to help pay for that. We reduced 300 positions in the city, half professional management. That was 10% of the city staff during this period of time. Since we increased the number of police uniforms, which is the most amount of police, it's most amount of employees, it's far more than 10% of the employees that we reduced. That gave us a pot of money. We also had new revenues from the expansion, the renaissance we had going on. So we then spent that by reducing tax rates by 20%, almost 20%. Now that was a very popular thing. Well, believe it or not, popular everywhere. And believe it or not, it was hard to do. But we did, and we had the discipline during the boom to reduce staffing, to reduce tax rates, and then to almost quadruple our emergency reserves. We created an emergency reserve fund in order to get to the point where we could do that. So at the end of the day, when the bust hit, we were able to get through it. Now, I fully acknowledge, I didn't start where Detroit started when I took over as mayor or some of the other cities around the country. But I think there is a path for cities, but it's not a simple solution. There are no simple solutions. It takes a strategic approach to any city that you're in with some strong and I think committed leadership in order to make it. And I'm going to close with something that may seem unrelated, but it's not. You have to lift an entire city. The concept of seamless city is an objective that we set up when I took office. You should not have seams in your city. There shouldn't be places where you cross a seam, whether it is a road or a neighborhood boundary or an interstate or a rail, whatever, and enter a place you don't want to be. Enter a place where you got to lock your door. You feel like you got to lock your door. You see prostitutes or drug dealers on the street corner. It's just the bad part of town. A place where there's no hope for the kids. You know, if there should be no place in any city where kids are growing up in a neighborhood where they're afraid to go outside. It's not their fault. And if I don't want my kids growing up in that neighborhood, nobody's kids should have to grow up in that neighborhood. So we set about an effort to work towards seamless city with an effort towards Midtown, which was that part of our city. Largely African-American, Democrat, low-income, economically depressed part of our city. And we had a tremendous turnaround in that city. Now, I could tell you that. You have no reason to believe me because you weren't there. You've probably not been to Midtown. But I can tell you a statistic that's going to make you understand what we were able to do there. I am a conservative, social, fiscal conservative. I ran in 2001, and when I ran in the Midtown precincts, people put on my yard signs, they spray painted "In Bed with Jeb," and they put them all through the Midtown community. And that part of the community was won by the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party. Okay? That was my starting point. So we put an effort not to gentrify that part of the community, but to lift that part of the community, make the quality of life better, because you have to have the whole community lifting if you're going to be able to make it all work. And at the end of the day, I ran for re-election 4 years later, city's 29% Republican, against the chairman of the Democratic Party. We won every precinct in the city with a 71% vote. But what I'm most proud about, we won the Midtown African-American Democratic precincts by 90%. Now, tell me whether they think that we made a difference in changing it to work towards building a seamless city and making the city thrive. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Rick. That was very helpful. We do have time for questions, and if you'll raise your hand, someone will bring a microphone to you. We do ask that you wait for that so that people who are not in the room today can enjoy this entire session. And while we're waiting for that, I'm going to ask Wayne for a point of clarification, actually. I think you're the one for this. If Section 9 doesn't allow for courts to make tough choices, and we're not getting it from city leadership, and that's going to put us back in bankruptcy again, what are the options to imposing different bankruptcy choices that can put power in the hands of courts or outside authorities beyond the city?
Is this on? Yeah, it's on. The courts are actually beginning to rule in favor of pensions being an asset that can be renegotiated in bankruptcy. So Judge Klein, in terms of Stockton's bankruptcy, has just ruled that that bankruptcy law should supersede the California Constitution, and in fact, that pension obligations are no different than bond obligations. I believe Detroit has had the same, the judge has ruled in the same way. So pension obligations are beginning to be considered just any other obligation, and so they can be, I think, part of the refinancing. It's still developing, but there are some optimistic aspects there.
Okay. Where are the questions? Right here in the center.
I'll address this to Mayor Baker. A couple of things that came out of hearing all of these talks were, first of all, the importance of giving your word. Be careful what you promise, because you may be held accountable for that promise. And again, I'd just like to hear how you deal with that. The second thing, which is similar and it addresses this pension plan, is thinking long-term in terms of your decisions, not just short-term. Obviously, there's a tendency to always think short-term and not long-term. Another thing I'd be interested in hearing is the importance of home ownership in voters taking a responsibility for what happens in their communities. In other words, the greater the home ownership, the more responsibility there is among the voters. And the last thing is your relationship with the city council, whatever type of government you have. I know in the community I'm in, there's sometimes a very difficult relationship between the mayor and the city council.
Could you keep the mic, because I don't think I wrote them all down, so I'm going to start with the last one, and I'll go back as many as I can remember. Florida has a very aggressive sunshine law, which means that no two city council members can talk to each other about any issue that could come before the city, on the telephone, in person, at all. In a strong mayor form of government, by the way, St. Pete's a strong mayor form of government. Probably the vast majority of cities in America are not strong mayor form of government. And that means that the mayor is just one vote on city council, and they hire a city manager to run the city. Strong mayor, the mayor is political leader and runs the city. We probably have a half a dozen out of 400 cities in Florida are strong mayor forms of government. In our government, which is one of those, the mayor is not on council, so is not subject to the sunshine law. So the mayor has the ability, which I did, to go talk to individual city council members on an ongoing basis. And I tried I had great success with city council, and they had success with me. We worked together. I think we really felt and saw it as a team. And if they had issues, for instance, I had one that was in transportation, I'd tell my head of transportation, talk to them, work with them, let me know what's going on, but work with that council member. If there was one that was interested in environmental issues, I'd put my folks related to that and work with the city council. And we really had very few issues. We had impasse hearings, as you do in union negotiations. I actually argued the final argument at the impasse hearing to try to make a point in which we were successful at prevailing on. So as far as your long-term issue, that's a tough issue. It's, we talked a lot about pension. We haven't talked too much about post-retirement medical benefits, which are another big issue. And they just, the national government CPA group is only now made it so cities have to be accountable and put it on their books how much the unfunded deferred medical is. And so one thing we did is we ended it for new hires and continued for others. That was very not easy to do. The pension issues are very not easy to do, but you have to. You have to look at the long term. You have to look at the financial viability of the city. And you have to try to get leadership that's going to do that. It's not easy to do that. You had two other ones I'm not remembering.
Well, one was home ownership, the importance of
Home ownership is I think home ownership is an aspiration, but not all people can afford to own homes. And I think that, if one of the issues we've just gone through in a national economy was a situation where there are a lot of people with a lot of mortgages that had no business having mortgages. And at the end of the day, that bit us very hard. So while I do believe homeownership should be an aspiration, there are some folks, when they're starting out, when they're getting going, they rent. I rented when I was young. You start out, you rent until you can save some money. I kind of believe people ought to save for a deposit before they buy a house, and be able to afford to pay it. So I believe in homeownership, but it's got to be tempered with the fact that people have to be able to pay the mortgages.
Hi, Matt Buffton from the Institute for Liberal Studies, now in Ottawa, but originally from Windsor, right across the river from Detroit. So my question's for Kevin. When I speak to my friends in Michigan, what a lot of them suggest is that, and I'm glad you pointed out the suburbs around Detroit are at least functional in most cases. Maybe it's they're surviving if not thriving. A common suggestion is that those suburbs should sort of start to engulf Detroit, and you peel off a bit of the city that's not working at all, and you make it part of a suburban community that is working at least better. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether that could be an effective solution.
It sounds like you're asking the suburbs to give themselves the political and economic equivalent of a venereal disease. Well, what would be in it for them? I mean, no, seriously, why would you want to annex a place that's got those sorts of problems and not much to add? I think it would be a pretty unpopular idea. I was mentioning this last night. There's a novel I'm very fond of called Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. It's kind of a science fiction thing, and part of the story is that in the near future, parts of northern New England have become so polluted that we force Canada to annex them. And it sounds a little bit like what you're talking about. I did have something I wanted to add on that question of home ownership, just because there's an interesting point about that. My colleague, Raihan Salam, did a piece on this a couple of years ago. There are social benefits that are associated with home ownership, but only in situations in which people have a lot of equity. Those benefits do not materialize in sort of zero down, no equity in the house, upside down kind of relationships. The stability and civic engagement and that sort of thing that tends to be associated with home ownership is more closely associated with home equity. And you'll notice that my native Texas was one of the few places in the country that didn't really have a mortgage meltdown, simply because it's got state rules that make it very difficult to buy a house unless you've got 20% down. Which seems to me like a fairly straightforward and intelligent regulation.
Yes, Rick, go ahead.
The first question. I agree with Kevin that there's not much reason for the suburbs to get financially committed to the problems of Detroit from an annexation or any other perspective. But I also think it's going to be very hard for Detroit to ever turn it around unless the suburbs become a part of that. Because you have an awful lot of resources beyond financial in the suburban areas, and they do have a stake in it because their image is a reflection of the image of Detroit. And so while I don't think any of them are going to want, and I agree completely with what Kevin just said, but I think they also need to be part of the solution. And that, to me, is a question of leadership. The leadership in Detroit, leadership in Michigan should help to rally that as part of the effort.
I'm from the Detroit area, and I'm one of those suburbs, okay. I've been watching the bankruptcy, and I'm somewhat puzzled when the settlement is working its way through the court and will be finalized. You sound very disappointed in terms of the percentage of cut that the pensioners will have to take. Realistically, if you had your way, how deep would the cuts have to be in order to make a significant dent in our debt?
Oh, I would cut them to whatever brought the unfunded liabilities to zero. So it would be a lot. I don't know the numbers on that, but it would look like half probably, I would assume, maybe more.
This is a question for any of the panelists. Is there a role for 401ks in, instead of giving pensions, some different method of financing?
Yeah, there's I think they call it 401A in a public entity, and our city had a combined 401A plan for a lot of the administration, in addition to the defined benefit plans in like the rank and file police and fire.
I think that one of the things we really ran into in the middle of the 20th century, partly having to do with wage and price controls related to the war, was having this paternalistic relationship between people and their employers. Your employer's in charge of your health care, your employer's in charge of your retirement. Pay your own damn health care and save for your own damn retirement, and your employer writes you a check every 2 weeks, and that's that. It seems like a much simpler way to do it. I mean, certainly in the private sector, but obviously in the public sector, where the accounting is just nightmarish and there's no sense of accountability.
I would add, look at corporate America, where years ago, the defined benefit plan was much more common. Now there's very few corporations that would still offer that. So you actually see that in private sector. People have migrated away from defined benefit toward defined contribution. The question is how to do it, not if you should.
I think this is more for Wayne than anybody, but I'm listening to what's been said about pensions and Chapter 9, and I'm trying to figure this whole thing out. Pensions are paid from either current earnings or current cash flow, or something you've set aside for the future, an endowment or whatever you might want to call it. If pensions are exempt from the bankruptcy rules, where does the cash come from when you don't have the current cash flow and or whatever you've set aside for the future? Doesn't that lead to ultimate bankruptcy too?
Yeah, and that's part of the complication when you deal with the system. I mean, to simplify it, you do have an asset, right? You have the pension fund that's being managed. In California, that's CalPERS, and there's something like that across the country. And there's the asset. And Rick referred to that as well, that when the value of that asset changes, right, then you have a different payment that the city has to make. But what happens is the actuaries come up with some number that says, based on the benefits that you're offering and based on their age profile and all these statistics, you need to give us this much money. Now, sometimes the pensions will say, hey, I can make 6% return, so you can give them less. Or they'll say, I'll make 4. And so there's all those games that can be played, and that kind of gets to the question in terms of moving to defined contribution as opposed to defined benefit.
Yeah, but ultimately the cash runs out.
Ultimately, the cash runs out, yes. That's somebody else's problem. Look, Vallejo, they're going to spend 1 out of every $5 if they're on the current path. They're going to spend 1 out of every $5 that comes into the government in the general fund is going to go to pay pension costs. That might be too far, and people won't accept that because if you only have 80% of your budget to pay for services, right, you need to pay for your police, your firemen, ideally invest in your infrastructure. I mean, there's all sorts of other city services that we're not getting into that need to be funded as well, and that gets crowded out. So I don't think it gets to zero. There's some number in between, but that is the problem. But there's a difference between what is fiscally possible and what the courts are saying too.
Although just to point out, in a sense, it's worse than you think because In the case of Detroit, at least, they had some years in which their pension investments outperformed their expectations, so they just paid the money out in bonuses. They called it the 13th month check. And millions of dollars were taken out of the pension fund that way.
We're going to go 1, 2, and then I think there was a third one in the front. Okay?
About, Kevin, about Detroit, and it's just a comment, and you can comment on it, but sometimes if you're in a city surrounding or a suburb, it's sort of a soap opera that you watch. But it really does affect us. Oakland County is one of the best-run counties in the country, and their rates, their bond ratings went down. And when they asked why, they said, you're in the neighborhood. And so it does really affect those that are around them.
Well, sure. I mean, there's always the question of what are you a suburb of? You know, it's one thing to be Greenwich, Connecticut, a different thing to be on the suburbs of Detroit. I say this as a guy who used to work for a newspaper company that had the great idea of buying all the suburban newspapers around Detroit, which also went into bankruptcy twice. So, past his prologue.
This is for Mayor Baker. Thank you for your leadership. I'm a part-time Floridian, so I am familiar with your leadership, and
Thank you.
You are to be commended. My question is, have you ever thought of running for any higher office?
That's my sister out there in the audience. You know, I almost made the comment when I went up there that Wayne's story about Tiger Woods, really his whole speech was about everybody should move to Florida. I'll give you a straight answer. I finished office in 2010 with my children were 4 and 5 years old when I took office, and they grew up at City Hall. And I made a decision to get them out of high school before I ran for another office. And my daughter is a freshman in college, and my son is a senior. So.
Okay.
Your comments about pensions have largely dwelt on fire and police and that kind of thing, but particularly in the state of California, so Wayne, this might be in your bailiwick, the education system is so extensive, public education, but also the community college system, and to what extent do the liabilities, pension liabilities of the education system affect the viability of the cities?
The short answer is a lot. Look at Prop 30. I mentioned that. California schools, and California, they have so much budget rigidity and so many requirements to spend money here and spend money there, but they have, across all their budgets, they've been spending less and less money on education. So the amount of money that California can spend on education as a share of its budget has been going down for a long time. And that's because mandates on health care have been going up. So as healthcare expenditures have been taking a larger share, they're crowding out all sorts of spending on education. And that's going to happen with pensions, that's going to happen with a lot of the retiree health benefits. So, and that's part of the problem, is as these expenditures that we've kicked down the road come, and those chickens come home to roost, we're not going to be able to spend the money on the services that we actually need and expect. So that actually is the problem.
We're going to take one last final question in the back there. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I've been sort of speculating, well, what could be done? I'm thinking partly on public choice lines, so this might very well be a question for Wayne to answer. Perhaps some entity, I'm not sure whether it would be the California state or maybe even the federal government, might offer a deal, something like, we'll help you get out of your current bankruptcy problems, provided that you adopt some constitutional rule. This would, of course, in California require a state constitutional amendment, that no entity can obligate future governments in their spending. That is to say that any pensions have to be fully funded immediately. And maybe on that basis, a deal could be made to help some cities or whatever out of bankruptcy.
Your final comments?
I wrote a book with Arthur Laffer on California called Eureka, and that's exactly, very similar to that is what we argued, is that the budget rules are so bad and the tax system is so bad that you need fundamental reform, and you need to put those into some sort of constitutional framework so that you don't end back up in the situation. I don't pretend, though, that that is actually politically viable, and I think, you know, if that's the goal, we need to have kind of a stepping stones towards that, because unfortunately, that's not going to get implemented anytime soon.
Thank you. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Just a couple of words. Something that is very hopeful. I would point out